Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar, How to Solve CCPA and GDPR's Toughest Compliance Mandates, Automating Data Privacy and Security for API-Based Services. My name is Elias Turman. I'm VP of Global Marketing at Integris Software, and I'll be moderating today's event. Today I'm joined by two data protection experts. Chandan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself at Integris Software?
Hello everybody, this is Chandan. I lead product at Integris and have been building privacy-centric big data and identity resolution products and solutions for over 20 years now. A little bit about Integris. Integris is a software startup. We're based out of Seattle, and we focus on building data privacy automation solutions. A little bit about our core capabilities. We help you automate your data discovery and classification processes. We also help you monitor and identify risks and issues in your ecosystem. That's primarily based on your policies and rules. And finally, we help you search for people. We help you search and find a data subject to help you comply with your individual rights.
Thanks, Chandan. Shan, can you please do the same?
Yeah, we'll do. Thank you, Elias. My name is Shan Zhou. I'm Vice President of Customer Success for Cloudinity. We are also based out of Seattle, and Cloudinity provides a platform for consumer identity, authorization, and privacy that allows organizations to securely transform their business to the cloud.
Fantastic. So moving on to the agenda, today we'll look at privacy as not only a regulatory burden, but also as a competitive differentiator. We'll cover some of the key compliance challenges facing enterprises today, the importance of knowing where all your sensitive data resides, how data is currently being shared today, some best practices, and how to protect that data, especially as it traverses multiple enterprise and third-party environments, which is a major challenge. On your screen, you'll see a Q&A window. We'll end today's session with Q&A. But feel free to input your questions starting now, as I may pose your questions live to our panelists at any time. Shan, take it away.
Thank you, Elias. I want to quickly start off with some of the data privacy issues that I think we are all inundated with. You look left, you look right, you look up, and you look down, and all we're seeing is a barrage of notifications from our service providers, from organizations that have exposed consumer information in an unintended manner. And the primary principle here is that more and more of our information are in the cloud, in our service providers, in the organizations and products and companies that we do business with and that we engage with. As we provide this data, there's less and less confidence by the consumers and by users that their data is being properly protected. And the consequence of this is leading to more regulatory controls. The topics we're discussing today around GDPR, CCPA, and a host of other regulatory that are state level, local level, national level regulations are a result of these incidents that are occurring on a more and more frequent basis. One of the opportunities that we see here is that companies see regulatory controls as a burden. Right? No one goes into a company and saying, you know, good day to get audited or a good day to go and compile that data. But what we want to provide is a different way of looking at that. The regulatory burden can also be a business enabler. And the primary principle here is to be able to extend privacy and use privacy as a way to extend your trust to your consumers, to your business partners, to the other organizations that you do business with. So this is why the major analysts like Gartner or Forrester are all recognizing that privacy itself can be a brand. Just like we have gluten-free and organic, it can also be a brand in itself, because now it also allows us to engage more richly with our consumers, more wholly, to build a better consumer experience through trust.
So as Shan just talked about, we continue to go through events that further erode our trust that businesses are doing the right thing. You've seen that over and over again with the whole Facebook scandal. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that, the huge Equifax breach. But most recently also the Instagram issues where a marketing company has been downloading or capturing all of the posts on Instagram And the same thing with Project Nightingale as well. All of these came as a surprise to us as consumers. And so naturally, all of these events led to or continue to lead into the need for more and more regulations. And what are the regulations asking for? They're asking for essentially accountability, transparency, and essentially asking businesses to do the right thing. And what you see in today's landscape is GDPR and CCPA continue to drive the most change in terms of how businesses operate and how they need to be accountable and responsible. But many other companies, many other countries and states across the US continue to create or develop new requirements around regulation and have their own privacy laws come up in the near future. So what are these asking for? They're asking for being able to, one, businesses be responsible, understand what data they have. But at the same time, you also need to support individual rights. You need to be able to support transparency in terms of sharing with consumers what data you have in your ecosystem. How are you processing the data? Who are you sharing with? Who are you selling the data to? Being able to provide notices upfront in terms of what data you're collecting. How do you provide ease of access to the data that you've collected? How do you make it easy for them to consume and correct it? And so this is a very challenging landscape because businesses traditionally haven't been responsible, haven't been accountable in terms of how data has propagated. Thanks to the internet and with the digital transformation, all of this has become multi-fold in terms of how it's grown before businesses have actually transformed themselves into accountable entities in this landscape. So let's talk about what are some of those foundational capabilities that need to be built to be able to help you navigate this regulatory landscape. So talking about the foundational capabilities, primarily it falls into these four areas, if you will. You need to be able to understand your data, where it resides in your ecosystem, whether data is in rest or in motion. You need to be able to tie all of that back to your obligations in terms of policies and rules, whether that's driven by regulation or your own internal policies. You need to be able to actively identify issues or gaps, find out where PI is residing where it shouldn't be, find out places where data should be encrypted but it's not, and actively be working on regulating those issues or remediating those issues. And last but not least, you need to be transparent to the consumer. You need to be able to provide a way for them to understand what data you have, give them an opportunity to correct it, or if they choose to not do business with you anymore, adhere to their rights and be able to delete that data. Well, all of this sounds easier to say, but it's way more harder to execute and pursue this. But let's not worry about that. We are here today to give you some tips and guidance in terms of how you can navigate this landscape. So let's talk about what makes some of this very hard. What is the complexity with being able to understand your data and your ecosystem here? Most of the companies start with creating an inventory of data that they have in their ecosystem. So they say, great, let's get started with understanding what data we have. And what do? They say, let's go ask people. We have people across our ecosystem, we have data owners, let's go ask them what data we have. Well, the challenge with that is, one, the process is manual, it's error prone because it relies on people's memory about what data exists in their ecosystem. And most often than not, we find out that what assumptions that the data owner has about data in their ecosystem is very different from the actual data that sits in that ecosystem. And with the lack of automation, you can do this as a one-time exercise, but you quickly realize that, one, it is obsolete. And we've had companies and CISOs coming back and telling us that, I do this once every year or once every 2 years, and I keep getting back the same results. And there is no way that data has remained the same in the last 2 years. And so we know that there is a gap. We need automation to be able to help understand what data I have. Because if I don't know what data I have and I have not classified it, I don't have a good way to protect the data. Here's another great example. Let's talk about this scenario where this is under regulatory requirement. This falls into the space of retention. And so the regulation requires you to define and enforce a privacy policy that minimizes the amount of data that you need to retain in your ecosystem. So that's your retention policy. You have 5 years or 7 years, whatever the legal requirement is for a certain data set, but beyond that, you're actively required to be able to look at what data you have, why do you have it, do you need to keep it, and if you don't, then you need to remediate and anonymize or delete the data. Well, the challenge with anonymization, you would think that removing the PII is adequate in terms of anonymizing the data, but here's an example of a study that was done several years ago where they proved that you don't actually need a whole lot of data points. You just need gender, zip, and date of birth to be able to accurately identify 87% of the US population. And so this highlights the gap in terms of what level of anonymization is adequate. How much of data do I need to anonymize? And it makes it hard because if you have scenarios like I have somebody who has a rare eye disease and they live in this zip code, that's adequate enough to be able to identify a person. And so this poses a huge challenge for companies to be able to understand what data they have and how do they anonymize it. Let's look at another example here. This is around infer data. Again, CCPA and GDPR both require that you protect something called something like a religion. And most companies think that, well, I don't capture religion in my ecosystem, so I'm fine. But you know what? What we realized from some of our own experiences with running our software in some of these companies is that if you have things like dietary preferences, or if you track PTO days in your HR system, just looking at those patterns can give you an indication of what the religion might be. I mean, the most interesting thing that I've heard, and I mean, I've realized very quickly that it's a common scenario and we don't recognize it, is first names. First names can be an indicator of religion, and that makes it a challenge to figure out how do you now safeguard all of this, how do you protect it, how do you make sure that if you have data algorithms or data scientists using this data, they're not inferring things like this to be able to use it for purposes that's not intended to. And last but not least, data in motion. A lot of companies today, to support the regulatory requirements, they're focusing on how do I look at data that is at rest. I have all of this data with petabytes of data, files, structured data, unstructured data. It's all sitting in different places. I'm going to go and understand how it has propagated in the last 20 to 30 years, if not more. But one of the key things that is quickly boiling up to the top is how do I, now that I've understood what data I have, how do I make sure that I keep it compliant? I've identified that here's a system that shouldn't have PI. It has PI. I've figured out how to clean it. How do I keep it that way? And quickly coming to a realization that you need to track the inbound and outbound transfers, whether it is within your company or across companies through your third-party transfers, that you need to understand what data is moving, how is it moving, and who's using it. And so this becomes a key challenge. Data is always changing. You can look at your data at rest, but as soon as you look at it, it's obsolete because there's new data coming in or going out. And so the key to protecting it is looking at inbound and outbound transfers. One of the key things that we came across is companies have access to third-party APIs, and you would have access to an API from a third party, And per contract, you're allowed to use about, let's say, 10 attributes out of 100 attributes that are exposed through an API. The worry that we're hearing from CISOs and data protection officers are, how do I protect that? How do I know that, how do I ensure that an engineer is not looking at the attributes in that feed and saying, you know what, I see an interesting attribute here. Here's location information. I could use it for a feature that we are building out, and starts picking up that attribute and using it in the processes. And so the challenge is, there is nothing other than paper trail or a verbal discussion that happens within companies to be able to say, here's what is allowed and here's what is not allowed. And so that makes it a big challenge for companies to be able to handle those kinds of scenarios. The other scenario that we constantly run into is third-party transfers and logs. How do I know that there's no personal information that's being transferred in these scenarios? So these are all key blind spots that we keep running into that make it challenging for companies to be able to build a strong foundation in understanding their data. Chan?
Thank you, Shannon. Next, we want to talk about on the same theme is how does data really move, right? And I think it was already alluded to, which is through APIs. And this is really the focus of our conversation today is really why does so much data flow through APIs? Well, it's because it's the nature of the digital transformation. As organizations go and adopt cloud solutions and move and migrate their traditional legacy applications into the cloud infrastructures, what they're realizing is that they can provide a better user experience, a better customer engagement experience by sharing their data and consuming data with their business partners. If I know 3 attributes about you, but if I am able to add additional attributes about your preferences, your spending habits, other things that make me more knowledgeable about you, it gives me more targeted focus for you. I can provide different products, different offers, and again, come back to a more unique and more customized experience to make the consumer feel special. So we know that today, today's world, data is really king, and the more data you have. And all of these data sharing processes are happening through automated channels, right? It's no longer the tradition of faxing information or delivering information in bulk. It's transforming information and getting information as you need it on the fly. And the way that's all facilitated is through APIs. So APIs are really the conduits or the highways of data in the cloud. And as we've seen through experience, is that the adoption of APIs have grown tremendously. And again, it's because of that digital transformation that's really driving it. And being able to provide a perimeter that's going to secure that is no longer feasible. So we need to look to alternate ways of how do we control these superhighways that are operating in a very automatic fashion. So data sharing agreements, and this is another important element, is that, as Chandan already touched upon, is how do you as a business understand your data sharing agreements are being enforced correctly and appropriately? Now, one of these are hired here is about proving compliance obligations based on sharing agreements. 61% don't feel that this is adequate. But if you look at the other items on this list, they all are also applicable to PI data, sensitive data. They're applicable to being transferred over APIs. So this entire list really speaks to and attests to the organizations who are not confident that just because they're contractually obligated to do something, that they're actually able to translate those rules and restrictions and regulations and able to translate them effectively into rules and policies that can be enforced within their application ecosystem. So some more charts about how they feel about these data sharing agreements. And again, low confidence. I think, again, as they look among the industry and look at their peers, and we kind of start off with a number of incidents, and Chandan touched upon them again some more. The largest of enterprises that you feel that would have the most robust and most modern and most fully developed and better resourced organizations that should be able to have the appropriate controls to protection for consumer data. It's not happening. It's not happening. And I think it's clearly evident that we're all operating in an area of uncertainty and doubt, that we're able to sleep all night saying that we have the proper controls. And a lot of that has to do with the extrapolation of those rules and policies to be able to understand how the rules are being implemented and how they're being deployed throughout the entire organization. You look at companies with multiple brands, look at large retail providers that's got sub-brands, got different business units. They collectively, they have a lot of different, you could call them maybe micro business units that are operating as their own and doing their own security rules, their own definitions, their own data identification processes. None of that collects to a centralized location that allows a CISO or anyone in a leadership position to be able to test that it's being applied uniformly throughout their entire business. And it's a very big struggle for big companies as well as little companies. So why is it enforcing this so hard? And again, talked about a little bit earlier, which is really around API controls. The first is you have to understand the data. And this is what Shannon touched upon with the Integris solutions, be able to quickly identify what type of data that you have. And again, it sounds simple. You say that I should be able to look in my data repositories, get some data samples, and quickly understand what data I have, whether that falls under a regulatory control or not. But it's not as easy, right? One, we all know that data gets dispersed everywhere. You start out with data in a central repository, and then it quickly dissolves from there to all over your enterprise. Two is that notion of a perimeter. The notion of a perimeter no longer applies in modern architecture. When we talk about service meshes, microservices, and the APIs are used to communicate between all these different systems, between B2C, between B2B. If you're an organization that provides a mobile application, you're 100% invested on APIs servicing those mobile applications. There's no longer a sense of a distinct border. And that makes controls very difficult to implement. Distributed environments, multiple cloud environments. I have yet, through my experience, seen an organization that has a presence in a single cloud. Whether it's all Azure, whether it's all AWS, whether it's Google, whether it's on-prem, private data centers, VPCs, you name it. I think every company has it simply because of the rate of adoption, the momentum that they have in order to sustain their business and be able to grow their businesses forces them to be able to have to be agile and adopt multiple different environments. So you may say, yep, I've got the problem solved in Azure, but do you really have it solved in AWS? Do you have it solved in Google? What are you doing for those traditional applications that it's in your legacy data centers, right? So again, just as the example of distinct business units, think of these different cloud environments as distinct business units that has that data that you need to protect, that you need to assure and be able to test that you understand what the data is, you understand the applicability of the rules to them, and then also a policy in place of how you're going to govern that data.
Yeah, I've got a question from one of our attendees here. They're asking about purpose. Like, what is that when you talk about purpose and monitoring data and purpose? Like, what does that mean? And maybe Chandon, maybe this is something you could answer.
Absolutely. So when we talk about purpose, what we are talking about is the ability for an app or for a consumer to be able to provide a reason for why you're accessing the data or using the data. And today, if you look at how that is executed, you would typically have a data contract where you specify, here are a set of attributes that we're going to use from this API, and here's the purpose of why we are using it. And there's a chain of events that happens. You share things like this in your privacy notice if it is external sharing of data, or if you're consuming data, then you're sharing it as part of your privacy notice and privacy policies as well. The key part here is the complexity with related to how do you detect that, right? So how do you understand that you've started with this purpose and you've not moved on to a different purpose, or there is a secondary purpose that you started using that data for, and how do you track and detect that? Going back to my use case about an engineer trying to look at this data point saying, great, I see location data and it could be helpful. How do you prevent from those kinds of leaks happening internally, incidents happening internally where people look at data and start consuming it? So all of that boils down to, I need to be able to understand who's using it, but I also need to understand what is their purpose. Has their purpose changed? Typically with most applications, whether it is an app or a human being interacting with data, organizations typically ask for a purpose once, and you don't go back and validate, is it the same purpose? Are they using the same data points? Has it changed over time? And that is the gap that we see in the market to be able to address the need to have a purpose-based solution.
Thank you, Chandan. The last topic here is also scale. So when we look at consumer scale, it's not your traditional scale. When people think about authorization, they think about data policy controls, they think about the API controls. The scale is completely different. And also, you got to be aware of latency. So this kind of goes back to the perimeter solutions. Latency results in negative experiences. So typically, the survey shows us that if you take more than a second to load a page, the likelihood of a bounce to leave that page is over 80%. So again, being able to understand the scale, understand multiple cloud environments, be able to address latency issues, and also be able to provide an understanding of the content and what Chandan just indicated around the intent of how that data is being used very precisely to understand what governance rules it should fall under is required. And again, this attests to how difficult it is for companies of any size to be able to implement the proper rules.
So let's talk about some best practices. So how do businesses deal with this challenge, and where do they start, and how do they navigate these different aspects? And let's talk about some simple scenarios on how you can make progress in the regulatory landscape that we have today. Step one, so focus on the foundational aspects. This is where most companies are today. They're starting off with the discovery and classification of the data that is at rest. While they start this process, whether it is manual surveys or leveraging automation, one of the key focus areas that we see lacking is the focus on reducing the surface area. One of the key requirements of the regulations is data minimization. So you should be looking at what data you have, the results of discovery and classification, looking at what data that you found, is it supposed to be in those locations? Do I have data that I'm not expecting to see? And that leads into the third part, which is having policies and rules to be able to monitor and detect those gaps, being able to automate those processes and say, let me know when you see misclassified or mislabeled data. Tell me when you see unencrypted data that shows up, or data that is not expected in a specific system. And most importantly, and this is where there is a big gap in the industry, which is a remediation process. So you're going to find issues, you're going to find these problems. How do you remediate it, and whose responsibility is it? You have privacy looking at enforcing it or writing up the policies. Then they're looking around to say, who's going to execute on these policies? Who's going to find those issues? Is security going to help me with implementing this program, if you will? And ultimately, the onus lies on the data owners, the source owners, to be able to go rectify those gaps and issues. And so there needs to be a program across all of these organizations or business units to be able to come together and say, together we're going to remediate it, we're going to resolve this, and this is how we comply to the regulation. So that's all foundational. But as we talked about, data in motion is a blind spot, and while it's step two, it is a very close step two in the sense that you need to start thinking about it, you need to start investing on it, because like we said, the data at rest and scanning that is going to give you a point in time which is obsolete the very next moment. And so investing in data in motion early will give you that future-proof capabilities that will help you with your digital transformation. And what is required in that? Again, looking at validating it against data contracts and policies. And doing it programmatically is the key to be able to ensure continuous compliance. And the last one is there is an emphasis on security checks. And this is not new. This is something that's been there for decades. Security and implementing security checks has always been there. But bringing the perspective of privacy to add to the security verifications is key. And I'll let Shan give you an example or walk through an example of how you can leverage this through progressive consent.
Yeah, thank you, Chandan. And one we want to focus on here was kind of hinted here, which is around progressive consent. And what does it really mean? So this is what consumers are asking for, is they want consent to use my information, right? Just as we all as individual consumers would like the opportunity to have and partake in the conversations in terms of how our information should be used. So when I use something like Yelp, it immediately wants to have accessibility to my contacts. Well, what are you going to do with my contacts? Why do you need my contacts? Because of Yelp. If you're using it in the context of we want to be able to send automatic invitations to reservations you may have made for a restaurant, fantastic. In that context, and again, this goes back to the earlier question around intent, right? Understanding that clear intent, but also giving the consumer a voice over that as well, right? This is what people are asking for. And again, this directly goes back to how consumers will do business with you. One of the ways, again, we see a opportunity within a burden is the ability to be able to engage more richly with your customers, to build trust. So based on the public surveys, 95% of people are more likely to be loyal to a company. Again, individually, we can see that happen ourselves, right? We like to go and do business, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's a technology provider, whether it's a solution, whether it's a plumber, you go to someone that you trust, right? And you're more likely to give them more business. You're likely to give them more repeat business if you trust that company. And this is quintessential to growth. When we talk about companies that are looking to grow their business, expand their business, this is a tremendous opportunity that we see that companies can apply in terms of how they engage, providing that unique and customized experience, making that consumer feel special, yet still ensuring that the integrity of their data and that you don't tarnish your brand by becoming the next page 2 of the news. So going to progressive consent example a little bit deeper. So there's a couple different examples we wanted to, but we thought this one may be most relevant in terms of what this would look like from a consumer side. We talked about from a business, from an organizational side, which we'll come to through this example as well. But we want to start first of all what that progressive consent can look like from a consumer perspective, right? So see yourself as a consumer going to do business with a new organization, and be able to, again, have a clear voice in how people use your system. So we've got a simple example here. We're calling it the Cloud Identity Go Banking application, a number of other banks, but I'm going to use the Cloud Entity Go Banking site. And as I log into that application, the banking site, the first thing it's going to ask me is, can we have access to your data? So now we're immediately prompting the user for consent. Again, not fairly unique, but one thing I will point out that's unique here is really around the duration. If you look at the consent validation period, I as a consumer can say, yeah, you know what, I'm trying out your product or services. I'm not quite sure I want to go full bore into it, but I'll give it a try. And you know what, I'll consent to you having access to the data for just a month. Because after a month, I can decide whether I'm going to keep my business there or move somewhere else, or I'm done my evaluation. But giving the consumer a voice. Again, we see this as a strong differentiator as a business to be able to give this type of control to your consumers. What a better way to build trust, not just saying, can we have access to your data, but how long we will hold it for. As we go through this workflow, the next piece is being more specific and being more granular. So I've logged into the banking site, I've consented on a generic level, the type of category of data that you can have access to, how long you can have access to it, how long you want to store it for. But now I can go even deeper and say, you know what, in order to fully try this Square app or payment application, I'm going to put in 2 credit cards. But you know what, those 2 credit cards, I will only provide you or allow you to have this specific type of data. You may be able to have card details, so it can use this as a method of payment, but I'm not going to give you access to my transaction histories. You don't need to know what I purchased previously. As a company, it'd be great to have that because now I can look at your buying habits, the time of day or time of year, what type of products you have. But again, the goal here is to build trust, right? And it's a gradual step-by-step. Trust isn't built in a day, it's earned. And we earn it by giving the consumer this accessibility. Again, giving the consumer a very tailored experience. Now, as I can consent to that data, again, in my individual profile, if I want to come back here, I want to change my profile. So as a consumer, once I've interacted with the application, I want to change my preference. You know what? I trust that this application is working better. Yes, I would love to get those promos, and I'm willing to share with you my transaction history to get those 10%, 15%, those additional promos, those coupon codes for me to be able to buy additional products with you. Absolutely, I'm now going to go and consent. So again, being very explicit and providing an offering to say, give us what you're willing and comfortable with, and as we earn trust with you, as we provide better services, as we provide more customized, tailored service to you, you have the opportunity to re-engage, give us some more information, and you'll have an even better experience. Again, this is what we see as critical to establishing trust and at the same time building a rapport with your customers on a very individualized basis. Down here below, what I'm showing you here is the consumer side still. Again, you saw previously what type of data I'm consenting to, but also now I can talk about consent to third-party data sharing. Again, putting the controls, putting the steering wheels in the consumer's hands. We have a notion of privacy checkups. We have data consents, but here I can automatically opt in. I can deny. I can opt in, opt out, or not participate at all. Again, being very transparent with what data you're collecting, how you're using it, the purpose of what you're using it, and then giving the consumer a choice of how they want to respond to it. Now here, quick example, as a consumer, I say, you know what, share the pay list. Do I want you to know who I've made payments to? I'm gonna set that as the default of denied, or it could be automatically opt in or automatically opt out. What are the preferential treatments? As I subsequently log into the application, each time I log into the application, the experience changes. So now this privacy advisor kicks in, says pay list, it's because it's been denied, it's grayed out. I don't have the option to check it, right? So again, having a direct effect of how the user engages with your application through controls that they can directly manage. Again, this is not, expose all. This may be a gradual phase. You might want to expose a couple of things that are meaningful, that you feel would be beneficial to your consumers to engage them in a more robust way. You may want to give them everything. So again, the automatic opt-in, automatic opt-out. Again, it's not all or nothing, and this can be reciprocally controlled, both as a business of the provider of that service or as a consumer as well. Next thing we really want to talk about is that data, right? So we talked at a high level, the type of data that I'm consenting to, but really the importance here is what specific details as a business is the consumer consented to what correlation of data falls under regulatory and compliance controls and what doesn't, and how am I going to share that based on those consent authorizations by the consumer. Shandon?
Sure, thanks, Dan. So what you're looking at is an Integris software dashboard which shows you your insights into what data you've discovered and classified. And this is an overview across all of your ecosystem to be able to highlight what are some of those gaps. But if you go to the next slide, you will see that you have the ability to be able to look at very specifically your data sources in motion. So an example would be you're looking at a Kafka queue or a Kinesis queue and looking at what data is moving through that, being able to understand, going back to our earlier part about one, you need to understand what data is in your ecosystem, which includes data in motion, and being able to understand what data do you have, do you expect to see that kind of data, do you have the right classification for that data, is it protected in the right way, and being able to understand all of that as a whole, and then going to the next part, which is, okay, now how do I set up controls, which is what Shan is going to talk about in a moment.
Great, thank you, Shannon. So again, continuing that progressive consent example here, now we're looking at it from the business perspective. So looking at the policies and rules that can be set up within the cloud identity system. And again, integrating with the Integris products and platforms to understand the type of data, understand the specific attributes that are being transmitted through those APIs very explicitly, right? What type of data, what categorization is it, right? Again, that API may grab a first name from another API. It may grab, birth date from another API, and then last four. And now this API, when it started out on its journey, didn't have relevant, applicable, or regulated data. But now through the services, through the engagement with other systems, now it does have data that needs to be regulated, needs to be controlled. And then also understand the intent, understanding what the user consent is applied on top of that. Again, putting all together in a very seamless way. So again, having very explicit controls into how the user engages. The little highlight there, the privacy advisor enabled, that was that little pop-up that you saw that the consumer saw that says, hey, here's data that we have that we feel is sensitive data. Do you want to consent to it? And our intent is to also share this with other providers, with other businesses that you engage with, because we want to give you a better experience. We want to provide more automation. Oh, you do business with XYZ. You don't need to re-enter your payment information. We can simply gather from there. Do we have your permission to do that so you don't have to pull out your purse again? So again, making that experience very frictionless, but giving them the assurances that we are treating their data appropriately and we're treating it seriously. And then when we talk about progressive intent and how do we apply to those APIs, again, it's a simple on and off button, toggle switches. We'll talk about the policies themselves, but being very explicit into which other applications can engage with my data. So again, being able to apply this in a very automated, very distributed fashion. You'll see here at the very top, it says OAuth client application details, and it says micro perimeter. Micro perimeter is a product that Cloud Identity offers that allows us to be able to distribute distributed policy enforcement and policy inspection at the endpoint itself. And when I refer to endpoint, I'm referring to the API endpoint. So if you're running APIs and microservices and service mesh, you understand the issues that comes through not just ingress and egress in and out of your environment, but also lateral movement of data. So lateral movement from east to west, lateral communications between APIs within the same company, but between different business units. We all know that marketing departments collects a wealth of data that typically needs to be regulated. What portions of that data escapes that environment and goes into a customer service environment, that goes into a tech support environment, that goes into a sales environment. And as that gets commingled through these APIs, we can effectively apply controls where it's needed at the distinct API endpoint inspection points. This minimizes latency. This allows for scalability. This minimizes the latency that the consumer feels when they're engaging with your application. And finally, a logical flow. I mentioned earlier about being able to extrapolate the policies. Some of the current methods and a very common method is to be able to implement these type of controls inside the application. So now you're offloading that responsibility. That's part of privacy, that's part of data protection, that's part of compliance, GRC rules. Now you're putting those in the hands of the developer. I haven't met a single developer or any individual who writes codes that enjoys trying to deconstruct those policies and figure out how they implement it in their code without breaking the code or doing it in an effective manner. This solution allows you to be able to offload those policies into a visual policy editor. In this particular example, just to work you through it very quickly, is a conditional statement. We have a conditional if the consent's required. If consent's required and consent's being given, the API who's transmitting that data is originating from a particular application source and is trying to pass a specific PI data field. If these two qualifiers are affirmed, then great, we will allow it to happen because the consumer explicitly agreed to it. We're in the clear. Else, it will fail, right? And so, again, a very simple example of a simple conditional statement that would be extremely difficult, tedious, and hard to maintain if it was hard-coded in the code. Because if you hard-code it in the application, every time you have an update, what happens to the policies? Do they break something? Do they still work? Are they still effective? Do they even apply? And then also, too, as someone who needs to demonstrate this in a reportable fashion, how do you take policies, implement in code, and visualize it and demonstrate compliance that the rules are being enforced? So again, a quick example of a visual policy editor. Again, this policy is pushed out to the local endpoint. It's applied and enforced at the endpoint, no round trips. Again, very important to the consumer experience because they're probably waiting there to, for some data to come back or for some action to complete. And in order for all of this to happen, is we need the Integris piece to show us what that data, right? To understand what data is transversing, what data is residing where. So as systems are engaging with one another, we already know in advance what type of data is there, right? Does the commingling or the inferred data get us in trouble? Did the consumer consent to that, right? Understanding that data is highly important. It's really the first step of this entire process. The second phase is really around the control aspect of here with Cloudini, being able to have distributed enforcement, whether you're in multi-clouds, whether you're on-prem, whether you have traditional monolithic applications, whether you've adopted microservices for some of the other products and offerings. But understanding the data and then being able to apply it and enforce it is how we're going to solve these demanding problems and also give the user a better experience again. So again, I think the messaging here today is ensuring that our goal is really to make sure that the right data is provided to the right resources at the right time, right? Whether that's a user, whether that's an API, whether that's a third-party application, it's B2B. Also to be able to have progressive consent or revocation. So more information I'm allowed to have that users consented to, the more capabilities I'm gonna offer them. If they start wheeling that back and start turning that down, I don't have to go chasing my tail through my application ecosystem to go and remove data, to make sure data are not being passed inappropriately from one system or being shared inappropriately. That gives us continuous compliance as well as continuous enforcement in a very automated fashion. And that's really the value of the business, value to the business, is a customized and tailored experience, but then also being able to have continuous enforcement and compliance based on how my users are treating their preferences of how they want to engage with me, and have this done in an automated and operationalized fashion.
So bringing it back to Integris for a moment. So we've gone through a few phases here. There was the use case that Chan talked about from a progressive consent standpoint. Then we talked about the need to be able to understand the data. So you need to be able to discover, classify, and understand what information is there in that exchange. And then the part about how do you establish controls and how do you make sure that you're able to execute on those controls and enforce them. The next part is you need a place to be able to manage all of those things in the sense that here are all the actions that you've taken, here are all the here are all the incidents that have been recorded, both from incidents that happened with your data in motion and data in rest. And that's where the risks capability that you're seeing up here, which is the place you're able to go back and say, if an auditor walks through the door, here are all the things that I've done to be able to manage this. Here's all the actions that I've taken, and being able to provide an audit report to a regulator, if you will. The other part is around managing your own program. So we talked about remediation as a key program and a process that you need to set up. And one of the key aspects around that is what kind of actions do you take when you have an incident related to an API data transfer? It can trigger a variety of actions. So thinking through all of those scenarios, being able to say that, you know what, if this is the scenario or this is the incident that has happened, it's a soft alert. It goes to the privacy team. They need to review and look at this. It's not enough to be able to stop a transaction or a process. But there might be other scenarios. I have unencrypted data that showed up, or I've got a higher classification of data that has started being transferred through this API. in those cases, you might want to have a security tool enforce the action to say that, stop this transfer before we take a look and make sure that this is okay. And so having all of those things is key to be able to establish an end-to-end process that will help you regulate and manage to compliance. So let's talk about some other scenarios. So what you looked at was one example, progressive consent as a scenario to be able to bring this to life. But here's a variety of other things that you can do. And we talked about the who part in terms of being able to have some of those controls in place in terms of validating the data contracts, again, programmatically, being able to verify identity, verify the API, authorize the API, but also look at interesting things like who's the processor of data. Is this application allowed to have access to PI data or not? Being able to set up some of those things to be able to regulate what data might be accessed by a given application. And also, interestingly, looking at usage patterns to be able to identify or get triggers around, is this a scenario where a usage pattern has changed? Could this be a new purpose, or is this a change in purpose? And being able to go back and create an alert for the privacy team to go and validate or look at that system. Here's on the right side, you have a few more interesting things that you can do by looking at privacy and security together and being able to detect changes in schema. You've been pushing a certain set of attributes, a new attribute showed up, the schema has changed. Is this expected? And if not, trigger a privacy audit. Being able to detect high sensitivity classification data. So data might have been transferred at a certain level of classification, and now you see that data of higher classification is being transferred, and you would want to be able to identify that and take action on it. Similarly, high sensitivity attributes. You had names and email addresses being passed in the API, but now you detect a credit card number or a social security number, and that could be a higher sensitivity that you might want to pay attention to. And we talked about encrypted and unencrypted data and being able to have an alert around it. And all of this, doing it in line, doing it at the point when the transaction is happening versus looking at a system at rest, which is typically once the transaction has already been processed. Back to you, Shan.
Hey, thank you, Jen. Yeah, and the back practices for deployment, we touched a lot of these already, right? So we see the importance of a need to be able to identify every user API and device. And that's really basically saying we want to be able to assign a unique identity because that's a foundation of controls. We cannot control if we don't understand the parties and their distinct identities for each of those distinct parties. Two, we talked about that latency. Best performance, it has to be deployed as close to the service as possible. Be able to support multiple cloud environments, be able to be microservice aware, be able to support both modern and legacy architectures. Inspect every transaction, not just first request, right? So some people often say, I inspected the first request, everything else should be good to go. No, inspect every transaction because that consent may change, that policy may change. We want to make sure we re-inspect every single transaction that happens because we don't know if the data, the schema, or anything else has changed. Deployable everywhere, obviously we want centralized management. And then finally, the most important part here is a seamless DevOps integration patterns, right? Because this is dealing with the applications. And transpose and take away those responsibilities from people who aren't necessarily adequately able to support it in a scalable and long-term manner. And then also be able to provide verifiable policies and reports that those rules are being implemented correctly. So again, general best practices here. And I think that I close this out, is really the data protection journey. It's multiple phases, multiple steps, but hopefully throughout today's webinar, you've got a better sense of how to understand the data, how to meet the regulatory compliances, what they're asking for, the challenges that are standing in front of you, how to better protect it, how to make the consumer a part of that process and workflow to, again, provide a customized, a better experience to establish trust so you can gain and grow that repeat business, to do more business, to be able to market and sell more products to your consumers as well. but it's a multi-step phase, and it really requires a balancing act between privacy and information security. With that, I'll close it out to you, Elias.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, you guys. We do have some questions from our audience, and now is also a great time, if you haven't had a chance to get your question in, to drop it into the Q&A box. Let's see, here's a question from one of our attendees asking, how are companies using privacy regulation as a business driver versus a cost to the company? Chandan, you want to take a crack at that one?
Absolutely. So it's an interesting phase that companies are going through today. And there's companies who are trying to do what is just enough from a regulatory standpoint. You see companies like Microsoft coming out and saying, you know, we're going to not only support California consumers, but we are going to comply and make this available for all consumers across the US. And you see a movement in those lines where there's a lot of companies trying to stand out in their industry segment and say, you know, we are the trusted company and you would want to do business with us. But you also see interesting things where companies are coming out with advanced privacy centers, advanced consent, being able to provide a lot more fidelity at the detail level from a consent standpoint. And so all of this from a compliance standpoint. But then you have companies like Apple who are coming out and saying, you know, we're going to build products that are privacy centric. We're going to give consumers the ability to be able to manage their privacy. We're going to do we're going to ask for consent in line. We're going to ask you for consent when at the point when an app requests for consent. And so there is an emphasis on how do I stand out, how do I pivot my business and leverage privacy as a business value add there. But also from a traditional perspective, there are a lot of companies which are establishing governance programs. They're saying, you know, privacy is asking us to do all of these things, but, you know, let's take a step back. This is something that's actually going to help us enhance our business. We're going to understand our data. We're going to provide better quality data to our business analysts, to our data scientists through this program. Privacy just happens to be one part of it. They are one of those consumers of the discovery and the classification data that we've created. But we're going to use it for better controls. We're going to use it to protect the data, but we're also going to use it to provide better quality data, because better quality data results in better models and better experiences to consumers.
Great, thanks, thanks, Chandan. I have another question here from someone saying, can my existing IAM solutions, and that, for those of you who don't know, that stands for Identity and Access Management, can my existing IAM solutions play a role in this architecture? Shan, you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're at the top of the hour, so I'll make it quick, but absolutely. So I think, you know, some of the attendees here probably picked up on the fact that identity access management can play an important role in this architecture, especially around the identity component, and also the authorization. And I think the platform that we built here allows us to be able to exchange data and work collaboratively with your existing solutions that you already have in place. We know a lot of companies already have some kind of solution in place that's doing some components of this work. What we're looking to is to extend those capabilities to provide, again, a richer experience for the consumers, yet taking advantage and providing better visibility into what data organizations are exchanging. So absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you guys so much. If you'd like to get a hold of Integris, Chandan's been kind enough to include his email right there on that last slide. Feel free to reach out to him with questions. Shan, I know you guys just launched an open source version of your tool, which you can download at the URL you're seeing on your screen. Thanks everyone for attending today's webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.